Hi, everyone. We've set up this Being an Engineer podcast as an industry knowledge repository, if you will. We hope it'll be a tool where engineers can learn about and connect with other companies, technologies, people, resources, and opportunities. So make some connections and enjoy the show.
And she was, of course, most upset. And there was no place in this small town that you could get anything like that repaired. In fact, they had no idea what they were. And so she made the statement, and she said, if someone could fix this, I'd give them the best kiss they'd ever had.
Hello and welcome to the Being an Engineer podcast. Today we're talking with Stan Bentley, whose background includes a mix of electronic design and manufacturing. Stan started Diversified Systems in his garage back in 1972 after graduating with a double E degree and grew it to nearly 700 people doing electronic design, PCB fabrication, and assembly. In 2010, Stan started DIVSYS doing similar activities, but without the heavy manufacturing, and eventually sold that business in 2018. Recently, Stan started his third company, DIVaero, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, focusing solely on ITAR Electronics. Stan, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. To get things started off, I'm going to throw you a softball question. What made you decide to become an engineer?
Oh, that may be less of a softball. I actually first got into electronics and then decided that engineering was the way to pursue electronics. And that's a funny shaggy dog story that I don't often tell. But I was in the 7th grade, and I grew up in a rural area of southeastern Kentucky in the coal fields, the Appalachian Mountains. And so, as you can imagine, we were pretty isolated from about everything. And in that time period, the first transistor radios, handheld transistor radios, came out. So that's how far back I go in this industry. And these early little handheld devices were crude, poor, AM only. And it took they didn't even have a speaker, the first ones. You actually used a little earphone, a little earbud thing. And I had just started to notice that girls were different. And so what was the prettiest girl in our class and school, I think, was also one of the wealthiest. She got one of these transistor radios, and of course, we all oohed and awed about this thing. And so she was in a group one day with this, passing the earphone around, and it stopped working. And she was, of course, most upset. And there was no place in this small town that you could get anything like that repaired. In fact, they had no idea what they were. And so she made the statement, and she said, if someone could fix this, I'd give them the best kiss they'd ever had.
That was all the motivation you needed.
That was all it took. I had no clue how this thing worked or anything else, but I thought this is something I have to try. So I went to the crowd and said, I'll fix it.
And how did that turn out?
It actually worked. I took this thing home. And turned out that I didn't even know this. My father was an electronics instructor. He was an officer in the Navy. And consequently, in our basement were some things he had brought back, one of which was a soldering iron. And he gave me a quick crash course in this thing. So as I started trying to take this radio apart, I discovered that the earphone, the plug piece, had a poor solder joint, and it had come loose. And that if I touched that wire back to the solder connection, the thing played. And so I learned very quickly how to solder, did what was probably today an incredibly crude job of soldering that. screwed it all back together. It all played. So I took it back, and true to her word, I handed her the radio, and I got my first real kiss. So that's not how most people get in this business.
Oh, that's a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that. Well, you started your career as a designer and eventually moved into manufacturing. What motivated you to make that change?
Well, actually, it really started in college. I was in graduate school. The program that I was part of was really funded through a NASA grant that ultimately routed to us. And in that, we were building a remotely piloted vehicle, which was kind of interesting. And it was really intended for sending into hazardous environments, particularly since this was Kentucky, coal mining accidents. And as part of that design effort, we needed printed circuit boards. And if you go back to the 1969-70 timeframe, there was no way to buy those. And so basically I had to figure out how to crudely make PCBs in kitty litter pans so that we could create the designs or implement the designs we were working on. So I carried that forward when I left school as a design engineer, had the same problem. Again, I needed PCBs and couldn't buy onesie-twosies. And so I created another small lab, making a little more sophisticated ones because we had a little more money, and very quickly decided that would be a business. And so I formed a company in 72 to design microprocessor-based things and make crude PCBs.
Now, the company you were working at before you started your own business, was that Randsburg?
That's correct.
Okay.
And yeah, Randsburg's an interesting company that name is still around. The company, but what they did lives on. The person who started that company was a gentleman by the name of Harold Randsburg, and who was kind of a unique sort of inventor, even though he did not have a technical background. And what he did was he invented the electrostatic painting process, and by which everything today is painted or powder coated.
Powder coating, yeah, okay.
And so that process came out of this company also.
Amazing.
So that was really what was an interesting story. I was really hired out of graduate school. I had no intention of I thought I would stay and become a professor because the life on a college campus for a young guy is not too shabby. And But this company, since they had invented the process, at the same time the EPA was created in this 70s, and one of the very first industries they went after was really the automobile industry, but more specifically painting, because anyone that was around in that era and that lived, for example, let's say in Detroit, you literally could walk across the Detroit River. The paint film on it was unbelievable. In fact, the river in Cleveland, Ohio, caught fire and burned. And so the EPA was looking at the painting industry because they were just, the volatile was just going up the stacks into the air, and the overspray was just being dumped. I know that today that seems like an impossible thing, but this was the situation in 1969-70 timeframe. And so consequently, a hand spray operation, for anyone that's ever used a spray can, you know that most of it goes everywhere but where you aimed it. And that's pretty much that was the case with the painting industry. So, for example, an automobile of that vintage had roughly a gallon of paint on it when it left the factory, but they sprayed 5 to get 1 on there.
Oh, that's staggering.
Unbelievable. The transfer efficiencies were in the 25% range or lower.
Wow.
And so consequently, you can see why they were producing, this was a heyday of the auto industry, about 1 car a minute came off of those lines. So it doesn't take too much math to look. If you go to Ford, GM, Chrysler, and so on, you get a lot of paint film. Well, the crudest electrostatic process would generate almost 90% or a little better than 90% transfer efficiency. And we later
huge gain.
Huge. We got those numbers up to 95 or 96. But the problem was they did this by charging the paint to 100,000 volts DC. And so if you've ever, as most people have, had an electrostatic spark, you've got essentially a charged atomizing device that's at 100,000 volts and you have a grounded metal object. You don't have to get too close before you draw a lightning bolt. And if you do that in a carburized mixture of solvent and air, you get a fire. So one hand, we could solve the EPA problem, but on the other, we could burn a factory. And so that was essentially the challenge that I was given. And that's what drew me out of graduate school. Instead of being a professor, was figuring out how to make one of these things safe.
Interesting. Well, what a fun project for your first real project out of school. Big one.
Again, I had no clue how to do it.
Well, I think this, what I read on your LinkedIn page is talking about this very time. You said that having unlimited resources and being surrounded by incredibly talented and motivated people is something few engineers ever experience. Yet you did experience, and that it built the foundation for all of your engineering accomplishments for the next 40 years. Can you talk a little bit about that time and just share, what you were able to learn and accomplish with unlimited resources and talented, motivated people?
Well, both of those are a blessing that few engineers really get, particularly to have both.
And at that age, especially.
At that age, correct. And this was really the result of trying to solve the problem of how to make electrostatic systems safe. And so the company was sitting here faced with an opportunity that was just unbelievable if they could solve this problem. And they were a very cash rich, even though they were small, they were a cash rich company because they had made very good margins on the things they did. And so consequently, they really had a very short period to solve it and essentially said, just spend whatever you need to spend and hire whomever you need to hire. And so that allowed me to hire the cream of the crop of the young tech talent. And I did the same thing. Since no one knew how to do this, there was no reason to go look for experience. So I looked for smarts. And we had the cash to experiment with this, to brainstorm the ideas. And with that, it really taught me a whole batch of things. One, I got to dabble in a lot of different industries, which again, sadly, a lot of engineers don't. We seem to get pigeonholed and we spend all of our career doing something that's a mile deep and an inch wide. And in this particular case, I had the opportunity to look across a lot of disciplines and to work with smart people in all of those disciplines. And so we did, in a period of about 2 years, we solved the problem. We came up with systems that worked. And basically, the entire painting industry adopted this technology globally. And so that, to me, was just an incredible opportunity. And with that, that's what I leveraged then for the next 40 years of my career was the lesson learned was surround yourself with the smartest people you can find. No idea is a bad idea, and sometimes the most off-the-wall things are the things that really can develop into world-class products.
I can get a sense of how seeing that actually work would give you an incredible amount of confidence that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise. I remember working on a project several years back, and it was with an inventor. And he was not an engineer, but he was a bright guy. And we had tried a variety of different things it was a very mechanical solution here. And none of them had really worked. And he came up with this idea that was just so far out there. And I thought, there's no way that's going to work. This is crazy. I'm the engineer here. This is not going to work. What are we wasting our time on this for? And lo and behold, it worked. It was the one that worked. It was just this out there crazy idea, and it worked. And that was just, a relatively small thing. Here you are, one of the pioneers of powder coating, for good grief, a major manufacturing process that's used by, who knows, hundreds of thousands, millions of processes to this date. And having a success like that, I'm sure you were able to ride on that experience for, well, like you said, the next 40 years of your career.
That's correct. Yeah, the irony of it was that I really didn't stay in that industry. Once I formed my own company, then it was really just a variety of industries, because what we specialized in was people would walk in with a problem. Yes, we made stuff. We made printed circuit boards. We put parts on boards. We created product. But what we really specialized in was bringing in something that wasn't working quite correctly or didn't work at all, and figuring out how to either in some cases just manufacture it, in other cases fix it such that it did perform the application that the inventor, if you will, intended. So we weren't really coming up with these creative ideas as much as we were helping someone with that spark figure out how to implement it and make the whole thing work. And that is really, to me, what has been the fun of an entire career, is that you don't know where the next application is coming from. It could be in any field you can imagine. Yeah.
Oh, how great. Just solving fun, hard problems. I mean, is there anything better for an engineer to do? That's really why we're here.
I don't think so.
All right. Well,
every day.
Absolutely. Yeah. You started your first company, Diversified Systems, Inc., in your garage, and eventually grew it to nearly 700 people. Walk us through that journey. How did that happen?
Well, for some time, I wanted to actually start a company, even as far back as the college days. And so by total chance, met an individual in a bar, and he was turned out was the chief engineer of a company. And this company they invented, I believe I'm correct in this. I know they made the very first ones, and I think they came up with the idea, the first dollar bill changers. And so he's sitting and basically they had created this, they put them out on the market. And the problem was, and the reason he was in the bar drinking was that someone had discovered with these early dollar bill changers, if they folded a dollar bill in half and tore it, they could feed both halves into the machine and get $2 in change. And this was before the internet, of course, by a long shot, but it's amazing just how well the communication channels work.
I believe it.
And so consequently, what he was looking for was someone to solve that problem very quickly and make lots and lots of these, because they had thousands of these things. I'm assuming thousands. I know we made thousands of the fix. And so that's what I said, well, I think we can figure this out. And so that's literally what we did in the garage, was design a very simple little circuit to fix this, and then made a whole batch of that we needed to make the circuit boards. So I lined up a batch of, much as I'd done in college, cat litter pans, because the very first polyethylene containers that come out, Rubbermaid had just hit the market, and polyethylene works out to be a fantastic thing for chemicals. So the cheapest polyethylene tanks I could buy were at the pet store, and so I bought kitty litter pans and basically set up a line to make the PCBs, and then on a workbench in my garage, I then corral neighborhood help and my wife and so on, and taught them how to solder, and we soldered these, and we made thousands of them and shipped them actually hand delivered them to this company, and they installed these everywhere into their dollar bill machines so that a dollar gave you $1 change.
That's awesome. And how old were you at this point?
24.
24. That must have been so fun. I mean, just working out of your garage, and you don't have a big staff, right? It's you and your wife and whoever from the neighborhood you can pull in and just make this happen. What a great time that must have been.
It was a whole lot of fun. And so then we received just word of mouth, actually, because we knew nothing about marketing, sales, or any of these kinds of things. But it turns out, a lot of companies that had need of something like that, either PCBs or assembly. And so very quickly we needed more space. And so we rented a small space in an office warehouse complex, but we also needed equipment. And being very, very new in the career and not coming from wealth, there was no financing. And so we needed money to buy just stuff. And so we had a cute little office. It was 1,200 square feet, so it was tiny. And so I started, I said, well, you need money, you go to banks. I thought. I didn't know about investors and venture capital and all of these things that you learn later in life. So I started going to banks and with this idea of I need to borrow, money. And it wasn't a huge amount, but it was maybe $200,000 or $300,000, which in 1973-4 time frame was a lot of money. And so I went to the major banks in town and was unceremoniously thrown out of every one of them, not even nicely. And so I actually went into a small town bank, and I walked in, and the big banks are not going to work. And as I walked in, off to my left, I saw an office with a guy sitting there, and on the placard on the door said president. So I said, well, if I go to the receptionist and ask to see him, I know how that works. So I just walked straight in his office and sat down, said, hi there, and told him what I wanted to do. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, he said, I'm intrigued about the possibility of maybe investing in a small company. Why don't I bring some of our board members and so on and come see your little company? Well, that's a great idea, except there wasn't much to see.
The garage.
Everything was in the garage. We had this nice space. So I go back and think about this. How do we do a tour? Fortunately, it was going to be a week or so before they could come. So what I did, I went to all of the neighbors whose wives and other folks had been kind of coming in and helping solder stuff. And we borrowed all kinds of things, from work tables, workbenches. We borrowed curtains. We borrowed chairs and decorated this space so it had a little entry office area with a little tiny desk. And then it opened into this, that would be about 1,000 square foot kind of just block wall factory. And we set all of that up with workbenches. And then we took a set of parts, because I didn't have enough parts that we could actually show a line running, and we have no employees. So on the day that the tour was supposed to happen, then the ladies of the neighborhood, I don't remember now how many, it seems like there was a lot, but it probably was maybe 6 or 8. They got there early, and we set up an assembly line. And so what we would do, since we only had one set of parts, these were through-hole in that era. So one group was sitting there, they would put the parts in the PCBs, and then they would pass them, and each person would add parts and so on. And they'd get to an inspector at the end of the line. Well, we didn't solder them. So the person at the end of the line then was taking the parts back out and putting them in bins. The thing got passed back to the front of the line. And so we had
too funny.
We had equipment out of my workshop and other things. So basically, we built it like this little factory.
And they bought it. They had no idea.
And they loaned us, I don't even remember now how much, but I think it was around $100,000 just on a signature. and no personal guarantees, none of the stuff that I learned a whole lot about later in life. And so we then bought the equipment we actually needed to on a more efficient basis, make PCBs and to assemble them. And
that is amazing.
It kind of built from there.
What a fantastic story. Wow. That's one of the better ones that I've heard. Oh, well, let's see. This is probably a good time to take a short pause and share with the listeners that teampipeline.us is where you can learn more about how we help medical device and other product engineering or manufacturing teams develop turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines to characterize, inspect, assemble, manufacture, and perform verification testing on your devices. And we're speaking with Stan Bentley today, who just has some really wonderful stories. Going back to DSI, Diversified Systems, you had written a little bit about the culture there. And back in that day, correct me if I'm wrong, but culture at a company was not the buzzword that it is today. Yet it seems that you were very proud of the culture that you developed there. You talked about a child daycare with kindergarten, a variety of educational courses, a 25-acre beautiful campus, a wellness center, and more. What effect did that culture have on the daily lives of the people who work there?
Well, it's, when you look back on all of those things, and of course today this is very much in vogue, but if you look back on it, I'd like to say that this was a brilliant strategy that we thought out. But the reality was these were things that happened kind of incrementally that worked very well and all of a sudden became, well, gee, that's obvious. Why wouldn't you do this? But they start with the campus itself. We grew very quickly during the 80s. And we made very, very good money because we could make printed circuit boards, plated through hole and multi-layer when very, very few shops in the USA, other than huge mega shops, could do so. So we actually, which is one of the interesting stories, that building a 25-acre campus actually was the building where I first started to work for Rendsburg Corporation. So in the early 90s, I actually purchased the facility and the land from the company where I really started to work. And we spent a year renovating that building, and we just gutted it and put everything back new. But then when we get to the late 90s, as the company is really, really growing very rapidly, people became a problem. Very much like exactly the situation of today, where you literally cannot get the people that you need, particularly if you're looking at these early employment, early young professionals and so on. And my wife actually came to me and she said, you're trying to hire these folks. There's all kinds of reasons why, they can't come to work and so on. And what you want are these young professionals. She said, if we would create a daycare, then you would be able to pull out of or pull into the market people that for various childcare reasons can't come into the market. And so I thought, let's give this a try. And it turns out the building happened to have about a 12,000 square foot executive office complex attached to it through a breezeway that we never occupied because the offices were too swank. And as I told all of my managers, who all coveted one of these because they all had private bathrooms, I said, if customers come to see us and we're in these kind of digs, first thing they're going to assume is they're paying us too much. So we never occupied this. And so we went in and just renovated this space, which wasn't difficult because it was a series of large offices and had a huge open area in the middle. And we just took out the adult toilets and put in kids' toilets and types of things. And we then struck a deal actually with Easter Seals to manage this facility for us because we knew nothing about managing a daycare. There's all kinds of permits and also some horror stories going around. There was Again, people of that era would remember there was, I think it was the Mary Martin preschool where they had all kinds of child abuse things that happened. Allegedly, I'm not sure how all that came out. But at any rate, what we did is we struck a deal with Easter Seals to manage this facility and hire the staff, and it filled up instantly. It held 126 kids, and it stayed full. And we took them all the way from basically newborns through, and it was a teaching facility, so it could do the kindergarten. So they were ready for them to go on to school. And with that, suddenly we were just blessed with just a flood of these young, educated professionals, men and women, who were, for various reasons, struggling with childcare. And so now they had it on site, and we had our just pick of whomever we wished. And the company grew like crazy with all of this smart, talent. Just, I can't even describe it. And plus it made you feel good.
Yeah.
One cute story in that, one of the older ladies in the factory on the assembly area came to me one day, and I'll tell you a second story about her, but it was interesting. And she said, "Hey, would it be okay?" She said, "There's a lot of us that are, our kids are grown. We're, either getting grandkids or we have no grandkids or whatever. Would it be okay if we went up sometime and maybe sat down and read a story to the kids?"
Oh,
I thought, I can't really see how that could be a problem. So we had this large open area in the center. So we purchased rocking chairs and we put in that open area. And immediately this became a hit. And it was just men and women. In fact, I'd go up sometimes to just sit on the floor and with some of the little ones and just read stories. But these ladies would go up and sit in the rocket chair, and they started calling it a rock-a-baby program. And so they would go just assist the staff with the kids. And, of course, the moms and dads could go have lunch with them or go see them whenever. And this thing just worked. It was just a tremendous employee benefit. And so other things then grew out of that we talked about. We put in a cafeteria. And so with an actual chef, and because eventually we were running 3 shifts. So we really were only closed Sunday mornings until really about 1 p.m. And so fast food and so on starts to get old really pretty quick, and its availability on the off hours is, well, the places that are open those hours usually serve stuff that at least I associate with 3 a.m. when the bar closed. But
right, yeah.
So that became a huge benefit. The cafeteria actually started to package meals that people could order just at their desk, and then they could go pick up these packaged meals and take home with them for the family. And so that turned into a huge benefit. Then my wife came to me with another idea. In her prior life, she was a nurse before we turned her into a production person and running purchasing. But she retired briefly because we now had enough folks that she didn't need to do these things. And she said, "What we need is a wellness program because you're feeding them too well." So we actually first put in a wellness center with really nice, like Nautilus kind of equipment and so on. So we had all of the treadmills and the ellipticals and these kinds of things. Then we followed that very quickly by opening a nurse's office that she ran, and where we then could do routine kinds of things for the employee, blood pressure checks and cholesterol, and someone is ill, do you really need to go see a doctor? Dispensing no meds or anything like this, just doing really very routine care. And that turned into then something that was a huge employee benefit also. And
yeah, so, you guys were like Google before Google existed. I mean, you just had this huge campus, this ecosystem of all these perks and benefits. It sounds incredible. Was that very rare back then, or were there a lot of companies doing these sorts of things? I haven't heard anything like that.
It was pretty rare. I'm not aware. I'm sure other people did, or certainly did pieces of that. I don't know of anyone in our geographic area that had all of those things.
Well,
the daycare
incredible.
in particular, I know that one was perhaps the most unique of all of them. But
what a great
it's just
idea.
an obvious, and it really, because we had the space and we were fortunate in striking a deal with professionals to run this, that it was just an incredible employee benefit. And we allowed the neighborhood to use it also because we didn't fill up 126 kids, but by allowing the neighborhood to fill the open spots, it always stayed full.
Wow.
And of course, they had an incredible space outside. We set up play yards for each age group because it was like a campus outside. So every area had their own play yard.
Yeah. Wow. What a fun mix of professional and just play. Yeah. Wow.
Yes. Now, there was one quick story on the lady that came to me about the before it was Rock-A-Baby. This lady, now currently I'm the North American Technical Director also, at least for the next year, of iCape Corporation, to whom we sold the DIVSYS operation and then opened a military group. So we have in this facility assembly and essentially PCB sales. Well, people are a big problem. But a lady called me, maybe 4 or 5 months ago. And she said, "Hey, I've retired and I worked for you for a lot of years and I need something to do because I'm going crazy." Well, that's cool. If your eyesight is still good and your hand-eye coordination is good. So she came in for an interview and we hired her. Well, this lady about a month ago had her 87th birthday.
87. Oh my goodness.
And
that's
I just
incredible.
Think that is cool. It's human interest.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
87 saying, "I am bored. I need something."
Oh, my goodness. I hope I can use the bathroom myself at 87, much less going to soldering PCBs.
Yeah, imagine doing assembly work. But her eyesight is good. Her core,
Wow.
It's just amazing.
That's some good stock there. Wow. Well, I'm going to bring this back towards the technical end of things for this last one or two questions. What are some of the biggest challenges implementing electronic designs into products?
There's Number one is, I think, I was blessed in my early career that in the USA, really, the PCB industry pretty much was created here. And so we could design products and we could either make the PCBs ourselves or with a very short travel distance, go see them being made. The same was true on putting the parts on the boards and assembling them. So consequently, as design engineers, we had the benefit of seeing how the product was being made and working very closely with the engineers that were doing those particular processes, which helped us to create really, really good designs and very manufacturable designs. However, now as particularly the USA, the PCB industry is virtually gone from here. And to a large extent, the assembly of those boards as well. Now, I will mention assembly is making a healthy return, but if we take the situation as of today, so if you're a young design engineer, you're not one of the old salts that had this benefit. You're coming out of school, you've got all these computer skills, you know how to run simulations, you know how to do all of these things, but you don't know how to make anything. And so you're creating designs in a vacuum based upon what you see on a tube and algorithms that someone wrote for you and parts that were made and stored in the library and so on. And as a consequence of that, your first design probably ain't going to work. And if it does, it's probably not going to be something that's cost effective to manufacture. And so I think one of the biggest hurdles today is how to bridge this gap because we got all of these bright young engineers coming out. They've got these phenomenal skills. They have these creative ideas, but eventually you have to make stuff. And unless you want to be, if it's just software. And so that's what I see is that the benefit that myself and my generation had as engineers, these younger engineers don't have that. And we have to figure out how to give them that experience back. And that's really a lot of what I'm trying to do and the company that I work for now. But I think everybody's struggling with this because my day, all day, every day today is spent talking to people about how do you make this? How do you turn this into something real? And that, I think, if we can fix that problem, it's going to be pretty phenomenal what all of these creative kids can do.
Yeah, well, amen to that.
Maybe they're all kids.
Yeah. Okay, well, Stan, this has been really a delight speaking with you. Thank you again for sharing some of your time today. How can people get in touch with you?
Well, very easy. One, I do have a LinkedIn page, and I will confess that I don't go there often, but if they send an email through that, I get it. But also my email is pretty simple. It is Stan, S-T-A-N, .Bentley, spelled B-E-N-T-L-E-Y. And then that is at DIVaero, which is spelled DIVaero.com. And I get lots of emails every day, and I try to respond to every single one of them.
As evidenced by the 87-year-old woman who's now working for you again.
I think it's a great human interest story. I hope all of us can make it that far.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. All right, Stan. Well, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate you talking with me today.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed it.
I'm Aaron Manker, founder of Pipeline Design and Engineering. If you liked what you heard today, please share the episode. To learn how your team can leverage our team's expertise developing turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines, and with product design, visit us at teampipeline.us. Thanks for listening.